So yes, now that we're recording tonight's webinar, offsetting is upsetting to wildlife. We'll look at this new trend that well, not so new trend we're seeing across Ontario, maybe in a new intensity. And Dawn, could you tell us a little bit about what offsetting is, and just super quick why it's upsetting to wildlife?
Offsetting is relocating natural features to some other location and calling that a trade, a fair trade of some sort. So we saw this with respect to the Ancaster wetland, where the developers came in with a proposal that they would slide over the existing wetlands so that they had more opportunity to build warehouses there, increase the value of their lands and so on. And the argument that they were presenting, and which is generally presented in terms of offsetting, is we can relocate these things and put them somewhere else. And as long as we provide something else in place of it, everything is hunky-dory. So that's the essence of the offsetting argument. I think sometimes it's presented in the form of, we will put 2 wetlands in for every one we take out, or we'll put in a bigger wetland than the one we're taking out. And the same thing can be applied not just to wetlands, but to forest cover. It can be applied to any natural feature. And as you said, Alex, this is a thought process that's being kicked around in Ontario, certainly over the last several years, and now being specifically put forward by the Hamilton Conservation Authority, and where they're asking for feedback from you and I on whether or not this is a good idea, and what that might look like if you think it's a good idea.
Thank you for that, Dawn. And yeah, we're going to hear from lots of different voices tonight. But as you mentioned, we kind of became most engaged with this with the Ancaster wetland, which was as the Hamilton Conservation Authority has begun developing their offsetting policy, we actually engaged on an offsetting application to the Conservation Authority, where a developer was seeking a permit to relocate the Ancaster Creek Headwaters, or the Garner Road wetland, as we've been calling it. And to talk to us tonight about both that pushback, as well as what's putting these wetlands at risk in the first place, is Nancy Hurst from Stop Sprawl Hammond. So Nancy, take it away.
Thank you, Alex. Hi, everybody. I'm Nancy. And yes, I am from Stop Sprawl Hammond, the imaginatively named group that we came up with on the fly, just because we were quickly making a Facebook page. And we formed a few months ago to oppose the urban boundary expansion that was just about to go right ahead without any public input. Well, I won't say no public input. The city did an online survey where a whole 150 people responded, and 4 of them were under the age of 24. So basically no young people knew what the old people were planning. So we kind of rallied and put a stop to that. And the result was a mailed out survey, which was supposed to arrive at every single household in Hamilton about a month ago. But you may have received it, you may not have. It looked a little bit like a company flyer. So if you threw it in the garbage, not knowing what it is, that's not surprising. So we have 2 options on the survey. One is sprawl, which is option 1, and the other one is option 2, which is freeze our urban boundary and build within the city. And we've got lots of space in this sprawling city to do a lot more densification and missing middle housing. And it doesn't have to be tall towers. It can be 2, 3-story, 4-story buildings. And that's what we're aiming for. We want to save our farmland and start spending the money and sending the love to our already existing city. And if you haven't seen them before, these are our lawn signs. And that's us setting them up at my friend's farm. If you could turn to the next slide, please, Alex. This is just our website. So if anybody on this call hasn't already voted for option 2, no boundary expansion, the deadline for the survey is tomorrow. And we've created a handy little tool at our website, which is ssho.ca, where you can just head over to our website, and it only gives you the option for option 2. So if you click on that, it will send your vote straight to the planning department. And as a bonus, the mayor and every single city councillor will also receive a message of your vote. And I'm very happy to let you know that so far, 6,137 people as of this morning had sent in an option to no boundary expansion vote to city council. So it's probably increased by today, and we're really hoping to get to 10,000 by Friday. And if you could go to the next slide, please, Alex. Thank you. So as Alex just mentioned, the Hamilton Conservation Authority did reject the permit application from the developer who wanted to move the wetland, because they clearly don't understand that you can't move a wetland. And that was as a result of a whole lot of public pushing and a lot of public engagement. And in the end, the Conservation Authority had to reject it because they don't have a policy for moving wetlands. So I'm sure we're going to get more into the offsetting policy later, but I just want to set the stage for you to let you know like a little update about what's happening at the wetland now. So if you could move on to the next slide, please, Alex. This is a shot I took of the wetland when I was there in June, and it's beautiful cattails, which are growing abundantly and wild there. And much to the dismay of the developer, who said it's all Phragmites, which is an invasive species. It is not. It's full of cattails, and there is some Phragmites. If you could go to the next slide, please, Alex. This is a beautiful shot of a wild part of the farmland that's there. It's not farmed right now, and it's just a beautiful green area full of monarch. It's a meadow full of monarch butterflies and all kinds of beautiful things. And at this point, I am going to pass over to one of, I am really happy to have my friend Carrie here. Her name is Carrie Hewitson, and she is one of the farmers who farms the land right beside the wetland. And I would like her to describe to you the land in its most beautiful state, because she does it so much more eloquently than I do. So if you hold on one second, I'm going to pass it over to Carrie.
Nice sunflowers. Hi, everybody. My name is Carrie Hewitson. I live at 254 Garner Road East. We are market garden farmers on the land, and up till recently, we also had a U-pick pumpkin patch that if you've ever driven by the property, you would have seen my father-in-law standing out front peddling his pumpkins. So over the years, we've been farming more than just potatoes and pumpkins and vegetables, but we've been privy to see the natural flows and rhythms of this land, the many wondrous things that happen from season to season, actually, whether it be, like Nancy said early, right now, it's just monarch, it's just beautiful with monarch butterflies right now, swallowtails, everything. But beyond just that, we have a healthy great horned owl population, swallows abound, swooping through, eating bugs. It's just really, it's a glorious place to be. And it would be a shame to see it bulldozed over, moved, relocated, or any such thing. Like, that's just nonsense. To move it, thank you. So,
Next slide, please. Yeah, perfect.
So, unfortunately, the land behind us has seen some troubles over the past week or so. Basically, some of the slides you see show it fertile, full of crops about to be harvested, kind of at the peak of their season. And unfortunately, over the past week, everything has kind of snowballed in a very short period of time. But a fella came about a week ago, sent by the developer or the landowner to come and spray all the crops out back, which ourselves and our two neighbors had land leases for. So without anyone's knowledge, or there's a slide right there of the horseradish that was ruined. So that field is beside our farm, like beside our house. And that's a local producer of Ancaster. Like, he's been in the community for decades, their farming family. They grow horseradish, garlic, They've done potatoes over the years. They're an integral part of the economy as well as the agricultural community. And it's devastating to see this happen to them. Our other neighbors had sunflowers and poppy seeds, wheat, and various other things planted out back. And again, it was just run over by some young man that was hired with no knowledge of what he was really doing. And they sprayed Roundup over everyone's crops and then just drove zigzag across the fields doing maximum damage. Kind of sends the message of sorts saying, like, we want you out. Even though we do have a land lease agreement till the end of this year, December 31st, they went ahead prematurely, sprayed close to 85 acres. And then over the past few days, they've been disking it under in preparation for a sale that hasn't even happened yet, but that's a whole other issue. I digress. But in terms of the wetland, it was in the direct path of many of the stuff that happened last Wednesday. I was frantically trying to get a hold of Nancy as it was happening. I had randomly called the Hamilton Conservation Authority and left a random voicemail on their general voicemail because there was a lot of chemical trespass and spray drift happening right alongside the wetlands. As you can see, it had devastating effects on the crops next to it. Just imagine what that would do to the microbiology of a wetland that's been there for millennia. It's devastating to see, as well as yeah, there's supposed to be a buffer around this wetland. There's nothing there. If you walk out the property, there's nothing to designate that this area is marked off and needs to be protected. It's open season apparently, and they're right in the middle of the target. And it's sad because as it was happening, the overspray, the drift, you could see it. It was so windy, you could see it floating in the breeze and hanging out over the fields and drifting from property to property. We were all just cringing, waiting just for it to touch down and devastate any more crops. And it did maximum damage. Yeah, like that's our neighbor's sunflower fields. Like our one neighbor who does the horseradish, he is estimating losses of up to $150,000. And our neighbor who's a flower farmer, he exports like all over the world. He's an elite farmer. He's excellent. He's looking at about $250,000 or more in damages. It's devastating that they could do maximum damage and like I said, within such proximity to such a fragile ecosystem. It sends a message and it's disheartening and it breaks my heart. Like, it's just, words can't express how upsetting it really truly is to see that happen after all the efforts everybody did, all the community efforts and community groups that got together to try and preserve that wetland and prevent it from being developed, or at least holding it where it is for now until later. But yeah, I don't know what else to say.
Thank you so much, both Carrie and Nancy. And I think for those of you who weren't aware, this is something that we all attended. Carrie, you spoke at the Hamilton Conservation meeting, where your kind of landlord, the property owner, was also there speaking in favor of the development.
Yes.
We wanted to really start off tonight with just a clear example for folks about this is who is kind of pursuing offsetting applications in our experience here in Hamilton. This is what offsetting has looked like.
Yes.
And also really open people's eyes to the fact that this isn't a theoretical issue that we're talking about tonight. This is a real policy with real impacts. There was an application to move a wetland before this policy came into place. And folks like Nancy, Hamilton 350, like Carrie, were able to raise our voice, like all of you, many on the line. We had over 500 people sign a petition in just kind of a few days. Like, our community was able to push back and really hold the HCA to account. And we're worried that this new policy is going to open some more doors. So before we kind of get in more into this new policy, I just kind of are hoping we can end this segment off as part of our pushback. Carrie, I believe you and Nancy were able to give some folks a tour earlier in our campaign, and we just have a video to let people know how alive this place sounds. Because we really want, you can see the pictures, you can see the damage that's been done since to some of the nearby crops, but we wanted to make sure people could hear what we're protecting as well.
Wonderful.
Can't hear the text.
So thank you both, Nancy and Carrie. I mean, if you can stay on, I think we'll have some time for questions at the end as well. But thank you so much for sharing with us tonight what's happened since, because I know a lot of people are really invested in this. And I'm sure, Carrie, it sounds like there's going to be, like the reaction to this is still very ongoing. So I think I can say on behalf of everyone on the call tonight, if there is something that we can do to help as you and your neighbors are processing this, let Nancy let us know, and we'll be sure to show up however we can.
Thank you. Thank you. We appreciate that.
Well, and yeah, taking a bit from it's hard. I'm going to be honest, it's hard to transition off such kind of destruction. But unfortunately it's happening across the province. And I think that's the first time I really heard about offsetting in Hamilton. Dawn, you've been around longer, so this may be a bigger conversation, but I know a lot of people really clued in this year when the provincial government tried to move over a wetland in Duffin's Creek and pave it over for what we later learned to be an Amazon warehouse. And similarly, it was citizen pushback, a lawsuit from Environmental Defense and other partners that were able to kind of keep the government on its toes. But part of their way to justify this before Amazon eventually pulled out of the whole deal was to say, oh, we'll replace it with wetlands elsewhere. We'll improve or we'll enhance another area. So that's kind of the first time this entered the discourse of the province. And then our provincial government, about a month ago, said that they were going to take offsetting to a whole new level. And this is from Emma McIntosh. She's a National Observer reporter. And this is where the Ford government's now announced that for every acre that they MZO out of the Greenbelt, they'll be replacing 2 to 1 with new areas. But they didn't specify, there's no details of this plan. And I think all of us on this call are rightfully skeptical about what this means. And to talk a little bit more about this specific announcement, but also offsetting more generally at the, kind of at all levels that we're encountering it, we're really excited to be with former city councillor and former Hamilton Conservation Authority Chair Brian McHattie, as well as Phil Putton from Environmental Defense. So Brian, Phil, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And I think Dawn has a few questions.
I do have, my questions were actually directed at Brian, but we maybe want to start with Phil and then go to Brian, because what you're describing here, Alex, is provincial policy, and Phil, as active with Environmental Defense, has been in the middle of this, including the whole ministerial zoning order, MZO fiasco that has unfolded in the last less than a year, in at least less than a year since they handcuffed the conservation authorities to prevent them from protecting these lands. So Phil, you've got quite a bit of experience in this. Environmental Defense has been in the middle of this fight. Tell us what happened up to here, what role you've played, and where things are going on at this point.
All right, well, I mean, to start out with, I think I'm going to answer your question in a way that really frames how we got to this point where so much attention is being paid to the concept of offsetting. What happened over the last few months is that the present government introduced legislation which allows it to force conservation authorities to issue permits, even where they think that the development being permitted will cause irreparable and serious harm to natural heritage features, and where it could actually cause landslides or flooding. And even under those circumstances, the province has empowered itself either to force the Conservation Authority to directly issue a permit, or else to usurp the power of the Conservation Authority and issue such a permit itself. Now, what's worth noting here is that this does not directly remove the power of a Conservation Authority to impose conditions on development, although that separately when conditions are imposed on a development, it can be usurped. So this gave rise to the idea, well, if we can't say no, then how do we deal with those circumstances where we're going to be forced to authorize destruction of a wetland? And so that's the real policy problem that we can understand a conservation authority would need to respond to. Now, the difficulty here is that the policy, at least as set out in the discussion paper, goes far beyond what is necessary to address that very awful and circumstance that shouldn't exist, which is where the conservation authority is forced to issue a permit against its will. There is nothing in this policy which says we will only use the option of offsetting where a conservation authority will is legally foreclosed from refusing. And so while a lot of the language of this policy, it seems on its face to be good, like a lot of these principles seem on their face to be laudable, what this really reflects is a sort of a railroading effect. The province, by the threat that it may force approval in some circumstances, has, if the Conservation Authority adopts this policy, it's railroading the Conservation Authority into going much further than it might actually be forced to go. And this is something that we see equally with the settlement area boundary expansion options that the city is considering now. So we would say, these principles should be much more strict. If offsetting is truly a last resort, that means that the Conservation Authority will only entertain offsetting when it does not have the legal option of actually refusing approval altogether. And then the second key issue here is, of course, the province wants to pretend that wetlands are kind of fungible, that you just make a deal with somebody and they can make a wetland to spec, but of course that isn't true. I feel like maybe I'm getting a little bit beyond the question because I was here to set the table. I imagine you are going to ask some questions specifically about the policies that are proposed, but essentially this is a reaction to a very serious problem that the province created, but it is a drastic overreaction that causes that has the potential to cause even more harm than the original policy, the provincial policy.
Thanks for that, Phil. And just to summarize, so make sure on the right track. So you're saying, the Hamilton Conservation Authority in putting forward this policy, in case the provincial government ever said, oh, you have to say pave over the Ancaster Creek, we're making you. They would then have this policy to make sure there could be some replacement, or they could get the most out of that forceful as possible. But what instead they're doing is this policy seems to be much broader and goes a little bit further than it needs to.
Yeah, so I mean, the policy should be, listen, there's widespread agreement that wetland offsetting, and I'm sure you're going to hear more extensive discussion of this from other people. There's no reason to assume at all that it's going to work. It's kind of a Hail Mary pass. You do something, you hope it will work, and you only find out, years down the road, once things have gotten established to some extent, whether it does work. And it's not a well-established thing. So that needs to be the premise, that this is something, it's a Hail Mary extreme option that you try in an emergency. Whereas in this case, they're assuming that you can achieve a net gain somehow. And there's just no basis for that assumption. But because they want to be able to demand what would be required to make a net gain possible, they're implying that it's actually possible to create a net gain. So I think it'll be clearer if I sort of answer specific questions about policies as we go along.
Thank you for that, Phil. I guess one I'm sure, we would welcome any kind of specific insights you have on the Hamilton policy that's before us. But before I do that, I just wanted to say one of the things we've noticed, and you wear a much more provincial facing hat than we do as kind of Hamilton 350, is we've almost seen an uptake in kind of this conversation about, oh, we'll add some lands into the greenbelt here, we'll take some out here, or we'll pave over Creek and replace it somewhere else, or we'll move the Ancaster Creek just over a little bit. It'll be fine. Is that is there a change in what's happening in the province of Ontario? And could you describe what that change is?
Yeah, so I mean, listen, not a lot of governments have been far from where they should be in dealing with these issues. But this government, to be honest, it just doesn't, if it had its druthers, we wouldn't have a green belt. We wouldn't have areas that were permanently off limits for development. There would be no one who was able to say no to development. So what all of these policies amount to are, they are ways of removing protection of land from land that actually is likely to be developed, and then quote unquote protecting land that is never going to be developed anyhow, and somehow pretending that that is a net gain. And that goes for their greenbelt swap proposal, that goes for this whole wetland offsetting policy. And basically, not only do they want to kind of take away any option of saying no, but certainly their intention, even though their legislation fails to achieve it, is to basically allow all these things to be relegated to an agreement. So in other words, by a stroke of a pen, they want to be able to allow development to go ahead now on the assumption that there will be some swap in the future, some activities will be taken in the future. And of course, that can never work, because if you're trying to replace ecosystem function, if you're seriously trying to do that, you would have to do the purchase, do all the construction work that do, develop the wetland as much as you can, and confirm that it actually functions and has the right composition, and only then would you be able to go ahead with the development. So that's what a real, even a well-intentioned wetlands offsetting policy would look like, but that is not at all what the government has in mind. And what this conservation authority policy does is it kind of accepts that the province's ill intentions are actually the law, and whatever the province's intentions are, and it's clear that that's their intention, and they're pressuring people to do it, they haven't succeeded in enforcing the authority, and the conservation authority shouldn't jump the gun and basically inflict injury on itself voluntarily.
Thank you so much. I know we at Hamilton 350 are going to be making a submission because the Conservation Authority is seeking input on their draft policy. We'd love to connect with Environmental Defense when making that. We'd love it if Environmental Defense considered making their own as well. But I think I'm going to throw it over to Don to see if he has any more questions for you or Brian. And then if you can, we're going to wrap up our speakers and then have a more open Q&A at the end, where we're hoping everyone on the call will be able to ask some questions as well.
This has been really helpful, Phil, and I think you really set a good context here. In this particular situation, the original incentive or incitement to draft an offsetting policy actually came from developers, the same ones who were trying to move the Ancaster wetland. And the board split on that question, but the majority said, well, let's ask our staff to develop an offsetting policy. So what we're looking at tonight and what we're looking at to have comments in from the public by the end of this month is that draft offsetting policy. And we've got some detailed stuff from Hamilton 350's review of this and what kinds of comments we suggest you might want to make. But before we go to that, we also have the advantage of having a former chair of the Conservation Authority, well-known Hamilton politician, no longer on council, but there for a number of years, who was also had some history with the looking at what we need in the way of wetlands, and writing a document that is the federal guideline on the amount of wetlands and the amount of natural features that really are needed if we are going to maintain some kind of ecological integrity. So I want to ask Brian McCaddy to come on and just talk a bit about, first of all, are you seeing something that, having your experience in the Conservation Authority, that how you would respond to a plan that comes forward to generate an offsetting policy? Maybe we can start there, and then we can look at what are some of the things that your research and writing for the federal government has illustrated with respect to this specific situation.
Well, thanks very much, Don, and it's great to be on tonight and see so many people involved. This is great to see. What's being talked about is outrageous. There's no other word for it. This concept of offsetting is a fantasy, and it was said earlier. Creating wetlands. People might say, well, it's not rocket science. It's actually more complicated than that. So this is extremely difficult. The wetlands are where they are today for a reason. The soils that are in those areas, the drainage in those areas, and the history is there for that reason. I thought it was important to think about the context, taking a step back. There was a work done in 1987, Elizabeth Snell for Environment Canada. And she said before 1800, this is a long time ago, before 1800, there were 2.4 million hectares of wetlands in Ontario, 2.4 million hectares. By 1982, there's only 930,000 hectares remaining in 1982. Most of that in Northern Ontario, so a much smaller number in Southern Ontario. Between 2000 and 2011, over 6,000 hectares were lost. So, 650 hectares, 615 hectares per year. And by the early 1990s, the number is overall 72% of the wetlands have been lost. So I think that context piece is critical, because what the offset piece does, what earlier ideas of sustainable development that I was involved with, way back to 1990, that goes with the white beard, is this idea of balance, which is one of the most dangerous words in the English dictionary, balance. People say, well, we have to balance the economy. We have to, between social, environmental, and the economy, we have to balance. We've got development that has to happen, and we've got to balance, wetland protection with development. Well, 72% lost already, and now we're going to talk about the remaining 20%, 28% of wetlands or less. And now we're going to start balancing with that remaining small number of wetlands. So really important to keep that in mind. The offsetting stuff is all about giving up more wetlands. There's just no more to it. But I did want to say, in the defense of the Hamilton Conservation Authority, and it may not be the same Hamilton Conservation Authority that I knew, but it's a good organization still at its roots. It's got staff that still care about conservation. It's got a fantastic history that needs to keep being referred to. There may be some people on the board right now who are less than supportive of conservation, but it's worth supporting them, and we're supporting staff. So share these kinds of things. Don, did you want me just to go on about the Environment Canada work that I used to do? And it was back in the 1990s, mid late 90s, when across the Great Lakes, all these 17 areas of concern were established, Hamilton Harbor being one of those. And each one of those areas had to restore fish and wildlife habitat. So the question is, how much habitat do you have to restore before you get there, before you can say you're actually restored? So we did quite a bit of work in the literature at the time, and looked at what percentages of habitat types do you need on the landscape at minimum to have a functional system. So for wetlands, 10% of the land in each watershed, a minimum of 10% needs to be in wetland habitat, and at least 6% in any one sub-watershed. And that's to accomplish all the wetland functions that we know wetlands provide, the water storage, the water recharge, the habitat functions, and all the great stuff the wetlands do, particularly in a climate change scenario that we're in now. So Ancaster Creek is probably up there, you know, but it was historically around 8% wetlands, and only 0.4% remained in 2021. That's information that we all talked about at the development discussion of the Conservation Authority a couple of months ago. So again, we need to restore wetlands and certainly protect what's left of wetlands. None of this no net loss fantasy stuff. So ultimately, who will decide this? And it needs to be people on this call that decide what happens. And it's so wonderful to see so many people involved here, Don, tonight and throughout the discussions. So there's something there at the Hamilton Conservation Authority that's worth pushing them to do the right thing, because they've got a history of doing the right thing. Keep reminding them of Bruce Duncan, the ecologist, the late Bruce Duncan, Ben Vanderbrug, who started the Conservation Authority in the 1960s, and Alan Stacey, all the great chairs they've had over the years, and remind them of what they're up to, what their history is, and what they need to do today. Thanks, Don.
Okay. Thanks very much, Brian. And I wanted to ask you one more question, because it comes up in the context of this paper that the draft offsetting policy. There's mention in there that Ontario Nature, in looking at offsetting, emphasized that there needs to be Indigenous participation in this discussion, in this process. When you were the chair of the Conservation Authority, I think that's the time in which the Conservation Authority made agreements with the Haudenosaunee with respect to harvesting on Conservation Authority lands. Can you give us just a little bit of history on that?
Yeah, I mean, these are their lands we're talking about. So they need to be not consulted. They need to be driving the process. They need to tell us what they think on their lands. And you know, at the time, certainly you're right, Don, we worked with the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy on reducing the deer population in the Dundas Valley, and they did the reduction, and the deer and the meat and the food went back to the elders and back to the community, and they did lots of other projects with us at the time. Just a little curveball on that is that the work that I do now up in Tobermory at Bruce Peninsula National Park, we're actually moving to co-managing the national park with the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, and we're developing a new management plan for the park jointly. And it's taking years and years to do that. It's not a fast initiative, but we're learning so much. And this idea of two-eyed seeing with the Western scientific view and the cultural traditional knowledge perspective of the Iroquois, in the case of Hamilton, the Haudenosaunee, and the Saugeen Anishinaabe people up here. It's what needs to drive the process. It can't be them sitting off to a side being consulted. The Conservation Authority needs to co-manage the watershed with the Haudenosaunee.
Thanks very much, Brian. I'll flip it back to you, Alex.
Well, thank you. I'm going to give it right away. So without further ado, we've been talking a lot about this draft policy. We'll pull it up on screen in a second, but we wanted to kind of go specifically through it with some kind of concerns from the Hamilton 350 team. And to present those concerns with us tonight, we have Holly Brose and Carol-Ann Forster from Hamilton 350.
Hi, Alex, it's Carol-Ann. I'm going first tonight, and I'm going to talk about the first three questions that the public can answer on the conservation website. And they do have a deadline of July the 31st for that. But I'm going to go through Hamilton 350 response to each one of those. And I put a few notes here on the page if people can connect to them, or it can give them ideas on how to oppose this. So first of all, our position as the Hamilton 350 Committee strongly recommends that the Hamilton Conservation Area drop its consideration of an offsetting policy. So for question number 1, no policy should be approved for multiple reasons, and these are some of those reasons. The actual website that the public goes on does leave a false impression that the policy of offsetting strengthens protection, and that's a false impression. The website doesn't exactly make clear that offsetting is not allowed at this time. That they may in fact think, oh, well, this is just a routine offsetting. No. The website also fails to make clear that this is being driven by developer pressure. The website short description excludes alignment with municipal and provincial policy, although that is instead listed as a consideration. And of course, it'd be much nicer to align with those policies that don't presently have offsetting. And Hamilton Conservation Area is also located in ecoregion 7E, meaning it has significant wetlands. So some of those questions there then, or some of those points, are to help the public who's interested in voting against this offsetting, or asking them to renege it or never to institute it, to answer that first question. Next screen, Alex. So the second question on the website says, are there gaps or issues missed in the discussion paper that would help provide a greater insight relating to national heritage offsetting policy? Our answer, a big capital yes. The policy paper makes no reference to and does not take into account at all the climate emergency. The implications of offsetting for the future avoidance of more greenhouse gas emissions, not included. And the avoidance of more damage to species habitats, not included. So reference is made to recommendations from Ontario Nature that any such policy should recognize, and you've touched on this tonight, thank you, Brian, Indigenous rights. There's nothing in this website, in this paper, that the public's responding to about that. So in fact, the Hamilton Conservation Area should fully recognize Indigenous treaty obligations and the right to protect traditional hunting, fishing, and gathering, the requirement to protect the integrity of the water, to prevent pollution, and the general obligation to maintain the ecological integrity of the waters and lands within the Hamilton Conservation Area jurisdiction in its entirety. Now, question number 3. So the question number 3 on the website asks this: given that the province has implemented mandatory permits through MZO, ministerial zoning order, which require offsetting, what should Hamilton Conservation Area do to conserve the natural heritage when such a permit is required? And Hamilton 350 suggests the following. First, publicly and loudly challenge MZOs. Make sure it is well understood that MZOs override provincial rules respecting environmental protection and planning. MZOs eliminate the requirements for public consultation. They eliminate the requirement for other features of due process. Secondly, make it very clear that the Toronto Region Conservation Area Authority, what they made this clear, that in fact any permit issued by the Hamilton Conservation Area for an MZO should be done, or is done, totally under duress. And thirdly, it should impose stringent permit conditions that demand full compensation to all aspects of the natural environment, that require replacement of lost or damaged ecological features at least 3 times greater than the area lost, and that require that replacement features be installed and are functional before existing features are removed. And that's pretty much what I have for those first 3 questions. And so the next speaker, Holly, will address the second 3 questions.
Thanks, Carol Ann. Hey, everyone, I'm Holly. And just like Carol Ann, I'll be representing some things that Hamilton 350 has been talking about when reacting to these guiding questions given by the Hamilton Conservation Authority. So number 4, as is written here, is, well, you know what, I won't bother reading it out loud now that it's in front of you all. You can read it with your eyeballs. So our response to number 4 is pretty short and sweet. So this approach would be reversing existing practice. So it's talking about aligning what the city of Hamilton is doing with what the Halton Conservation Authority is doing with offsetting. So this would be a reverse of what's happening right now. So right now, the Hamilton Conservation Authority uses its ecological expertise to inform municipal policies. And this makes sense because the Conservation Authority is where all the watershed engineers and hydrogeologists and people like that hang out. They've got the expertise. And currently, that's the flow of information, is Hamilton Conservation Authority towards helping out the city. But our stance from 350 is that neither the municipal government nor the Halton Conservation Authority should be embracing these offsetting policies at all. Okie doke, moving down to number 5. I will just read these aloud. I think it helps a little bit with understanding the info. So the discussion paper provides a draft policy framework in section 9, which I don't know, Alex might have a slide with the key principles. If not, I'll go through them. But anyhow, they talk about 7 key principles that will be guiding the offsetting policy. So just in general, a couple of notes about these 7 principles that are within their draft is, one is that none of them really take into account the climate emergency that we're experiencing. And second of all, as others have mentioned, 350 has also noticed that the majority of this offsetting policy discussion assumes that greater or equal ecological compensation can actually be achieved, when perhaps this is not possible at all. So if we don't have a slide with the principles on it, that's okay. I'll just quickly address it. So if you haven't seen the Hamilton Conservation Authority's draft of this policy, they have these in section 9, they have these 7 key principles of what their official policy might potentially look like in the future. So of those 7 principles, 1 and 2 are titled adherence to mitigation hierarchy and achievement of net gain, respectively. So in these first 2 points, something noticed is really vague phrasing. For example, a phrase like mitigate any unavoidable negative impacts. And this vague phrasing leaves room for interpretation by a developer, which is not great. And bottom line, impacts are always avoidable if our conservation authority is able to say no to development and not play a game of offsetting at all. Number 3 of their proposed 7 principles is entitled offsetting has limits. And this 3rd principle is probably the most important one because it's the only one that addresses that some lands should be off limits, period. And it's quite possible that in most situations, the ecological value of this land or feature to our food production, drinking water, air filtration as a carbon sink, or talking about the microbiology that's grown over many years that exists there, that stuff cannot be replaced. It's there for a reason, as has been mentioned in this webinar already. Moving on to number 4, which is entitled equivalency. So this principle discusses that the land that is to be offset should be made equivalent in terms of size and the quality of the land. Now there's a lot more vague phrasing in here, again, that's left open to the interpretation of the developer. And nowhere does it make mention that, for example, a wetland should be specifically compensated with a wetland and not some other kind of feature, and definitely not some other kind of feature that happens to be some, stinky stormwater pond that many of us may have seen in our neighborhoods before that ends up being toxic, after a few years and is very gross. We don't want that. Nor does it make mention of what currently exists in the place where the new man-made feature would be going. So for example, will a valuable forest be cleared to make way for our new artificial wetlands? Because that's not exactly what we want to achieve here. Number 5 is entitled Permanent Outcomes, which notes that the offset should be designed, and it used the words designed specifically, to last as long as the project's impacts do. But it does not say what's to be done if this, offset fails and doesn't last that long, which is a very real probability. Number 6 is entitled Alignment with Municipal Policies and Approaches. This principle echoes what we were talking about in question 4. And again, our environmental experts are at the Conservation Authority. And the Conservation Authority should be the leaders in defining what is to be done to manage our ecosystems and watersheds. And the city environmental policies should then be taking notes from those Conservation Authority experts, not the other way around. And lastly of the 7 principles is entitled Cost Recovery. And this says that the cost of the offset should be recovered. But again, the wording in this principle is very vague, left dangerously open to the interpretation of the developer, and it leaves room for the developer not to be accountable for the full cost of the offset or its ongoing monitoring, which is another very real possibility, as the true cost of creating this new feature, which again might need to be, if you really wanted to do it well, might have to be created like a year or two before you actually pave over the wetland to make sure you can transfer everything over. Then there's monitoring that's ongoing, possibly in perpetuity. If you really want to do it well, the cost of creating these artificial features is really high and possibly rivals the cost that a developer would even make from the profit of building in the first place. So this cost thing is really important to have, not vague, but specific details about what is expected. And lastly, question 6, the last guiding question for our comments on this policy is, should the approach in the draft policy framework for offsetting be based on a no net loss or a net gain philosophy? And what are your thoughts on the preferred best option? We're given 2 options here, and some really great points have been made about this that Hamilton 350 echoes as well. So this question is making a big assumption. It's suggesting that offsetting can actually be achieved and that developers can actually recreate a wetland, a forest, or fertile soil, which we don't really know if that's possible. It is doubtful whether a natural heritage feature can be created artificially to any meaningful degree at all. And it would be impossible to derive these same ecological values that we get, such as biodiversity, air and water filtration, flood prevention, food production. These are important things from a new artificial wetland or feature, what have you, who is being made by a developer that is rushing to appease an offsetting policy as cheaply and quickly as possible before they can build. So we fear that pretending, which is another word I've heard earlier in this webinar, that pretending that a natural feature, like for a wetland, for example, can be offset at all, as the very existence of this policy suggests, is dangerous and will only leave us in a net loss scenario, not net gain or no net loss, as this question guides us to think. So as we see climate change making its mark right now across our province, our country, and the world, perhaps this is not the moment to lose any more natural heritage features that may buffer the blow to our safety with these priceless, the priceless ecological value of these features. So our stance is no development is worth our health and safety. There is therefore no offsetting policy should be permitted. And our lands are not something to play make-believe with and wish away somewhere a little to the left of where a developer might have been able to make some money. So that's it for me. Those are the end of our comments there.
Thank you so much, Holly and Carol-Ann, for going through that with us. And we're encouraging all of you to make comments as well. So Steph's put this link in the chat a few times, and I'm sure it's going to pop up there again soon. And then just a reminder to mute yourselves if you're in the background as well. But yeah, so the link will be posted soon in the chat. It's been posted several times already, but this is what the website looks like when you get there. You can also get here by just typing into Google Hamilton Conservation Authority offsetting. You'll get here. Scott Peck is the the Deputy Chief Administrative Officer with the CA. And if you have questions or want to get in touch about the policy, you can also email him directly, and his email is just on the side there. We've had Scott speak at previous webinars, and he's been a great voice for conservation, and he's the staff person looking over these comments. So this is what it looks like when you get there. Again, key date is it's the 31st, so is the last day, so the end of the month. If you scroll down when you get to the site, you can read the policy, and then you can also click this button, submit comments at the bottom, or again, you can submit comments by emailing Scott. But by clicking either of these, you can submit comments, and then you'll be prompted after kind of reviewing the policy, and you can also see the policy online there. You'll be prompted with these 6 questions talked about. But we really just wanted to stress, you can chat about more than just these questions. So for example, we've been talking a lot about the intersecting climate and biodiversity crises. Earth system scientists have said we've already overshot when it comes to biodiversity loss, as in we've gone too far, we've lost too much. This is the decade of biodiversity, I believe, at the United Nations. Like, this is being recognized as an international priority. And then when we just go back and we look at, here's the Spencer Creek subwatershed broken down, and we look at those numbers that Brian was telling us about, where they should be versus where so many of our subwatersheds are on so many different boundaries, whether they be foresting, with stream bank vegetation, or wetland coverage. How can we afford to balance loss, to lose any more when we're already so far below what we should be, where our own standards suggest we are. And Holly and so many others have also kind of really underlined that the science behind this is just changing so quickly, and we learn so much more every year, and that means we learn a lot more about what we've lost. So with that, unless I forgot